I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 97 of EO Radio Show. This is the 15th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on the filings in Nevada and Arizona, Washington State and Oregon, Alaska and Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts and Connecticut, Maine and Vermont, Rhode Island and New Hampshire, Florida and Louisiana, North and South Carolina, Kentucky and Tennessee, Oklahoma and Texas, New Mexico and Utah, and last month, Colorado and Wyoming. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Washington, D.C., which is not a state, but does have incorporation and foreign registration rules for businesses operating there. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there is a playlist just for state filing requirements. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we are focusing on issues like the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the jurisdictions we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the organization may need to have a legal presence and be registered in Washington, D.C. For the details on the District of Columbia rules, we welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, with me, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, Joe worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back, Joe.
Hey, it's good to be back again.
As we've been doing lately, let's start with any updates to state rules we've already covered. Anything new there?
Yeah, no, since we recorded last back in August, Alabama has updated their annual report filing requirements. We talked about this prior to 2024. Their annual reports were due to their Department of Revenue, not their Secretary of State, which is kind of unusual. And then this year in 2024, they changed it to the Secretary of State. Unfortunately, there in the state, this rollout led to a lot of confusion. And effective October 1st, they're going to revert back to the pre-2024 process and report again to the Department of Revenue. It sounded like there was some issues of again, we talk about this, getting email from the state and email addresses that are no longer current, which we talk about keeping yourself current. This is a good sign to that. The state got caught up in a system where nobody really was getting the information to where they needed to do their new things. And a lot of companies just sort of fell out of compliance just by not knowing what to do from the state. Yeah, that's rough. I know the states have put a big effort into setting all this stuff up to do online over the past, 5 or 10 years. And there's going to be glitches, but you're right. You have to check constantly to stay up to date on all these rules.
So, as they say, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program and talk about the District of Columbia. What are the rules there?
For sure. So we've talked about this, I think, before when we've talked about this, but the District of Columbia is obviously not a state and it is therefore governed differently. There they have a Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection, and that governs entity formations. For their domestic nonprofit corporations, they have a Form DNP-1, which is their Articles of Incorporation of a domestic nonprofit corporation. And it's a one-page form. And yes, as that indicates, yes, it's very basic. There's your name, whether it will have members or not, a hardwired confirmation that you're incorporating under DC Code Title 29, Chapter 24, which again, we talk about, look at your local rules, make sure you understand what that means here. You have to have your registered agent. Section 5 there is for your directors and your officers. The directions are very explicit, quote, names, residence, and business address, unquote, of all directors and officers who control the financial or operational decisions or have the ability to direct day-to-day operations. So that's a very large, very robust group, number one. And number two, as we often talk about, we'll talk about here, is that you're talking business and residential addresses both. So that's a lot of thinking and a lot of information that's coming out here.
Yeah, and a lot of private information.
Yes. Section 6 is a blank fill-in for, quote, miscellaneous provisions, unquote. The directions here note you do not need to include the purpose or purpose for which nonprofit corporation is organized, the distribution of assets on dissolution, or provisions required if the corporation is to be exempt from taxation under federal, state, or local law. They may be included in this section, meaning that really for our purposes, this is where you're going to put your 501c3 dissolution language. For the bigger picture, we want this, even if the district doesn't care if you put it in. The bigger picture is all the rest of us in the real world care about that. And if these provisions exceed the fill-in, you're allowed to attach a statement to it, which is just a simple type it out, put it, attach it. At least one incorporator must sign as well. Unlike other forms we've seen, this one has an admonishment above the signature line that, quote, you agree that anyone who makes false statements can be punished by criminal penalties of a fine up to $1,000, imprisonment up to 180 days, or both under the District Code Section 22-2405. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, they're serious there.
They're very serious.
Yeah, and I'll note, although they say in their instructions that you don't have to include purposes and other provisions that are typically required for a charitable organization, when filing for exempt status, it's really helpful to have actually included those in the Articles of Incorporation. So before omitting that from the Articles of Incorporation, I would think really carefully about how that's going to affect the exemption application process.
We think about it when you file your IRS 1023, the second batch of questions after who you are and who your directors are is where in your articles, where in your bylaws do you have these provisions?
Yeah.
So
it doesn't really I don't think it saves much work to leave it out of the articles. And there's also implications for charitable trust law and a variety of other things. So word to the wise, think carefully about leaving anything out that's important to exempt status. What about a foreign organization that intends to do business in the District of Columbia? How do they get themselves compliant?
As we discussed last time with Colorado, DC2 has a form that covers all their foreign entities, the LLCs, the LPs, and even our nonprofit corporations. This is the Form FN1, the Foreign Registration Statement. Again, this is very straightforward and asks for the basics of all the foreign registrations, your name, type of entity, your alternate name if your name is not available in the district, where you were formed, an address, your DC registered agent. It does have the same director or officer's requirements as the domestic articles right here in this first registration. Has that same admonishment about false statements. And then, yes, we've talked about this. A good standing certificate from your home state needs to be within 90 days of the filing and attached to it.
Okay, that's pretty comprehensive. What's the cost and response time for filing for a domestic and a foreign nonprofit in DC?
Both the domestic and the foreign will be a filing fee of $80, which isn't unreasonable. For the district's business registrations FAQ, for online filings, Corporation Division will process non-expedited filings within 15 business days from the date of submission. And then the expedite has a same day for $100 and a $50 for a 3-day service. They have an online filing portal called Corp Online. We've attached that in the show links. And their website also, then one of the expedite fees is required for all walk-in over-the-counters. You can't just pay your $80 if you're going to have someone file it over the counter. You have to choose some manner of expedite, which is kind of interesting. Usually that's, especially like we talk about here in California, that's one place where until recently you couldn't even use the expedite at all when you did an over-the-counter. It's only recently that they've upgraded that, like at the end of last year. So here we have the exact opposite. You can't just go in and say, oh, file my my stuff. It's like, well, you have to expedite it if you come in person.
Okay. So that's going to discourage in person.
Yes. We're back to it's encouraging us to go online, as we were just talking about at the beginning.
Let's turn to the annual filings. Is there an annual, biannual? What does it look like in DC?
Every domestic and foreign corporation, and including the nonprofits, is required to file 2-year reports with the corporation, not 1 year, but 2 years. But your first report is due after the next year. So your first report are due April 1st of the very next year after your year of registration. And then subsequent reports are due April 1st every 2 years thereafter. So if we form this week here in September of 2024, our first report will be due April 1st, 2025, but then our next one won't be till April 1st, 2027. And those two are another $80, the same as your filing. And here, which was interesting, usually you get some leeway, but the district will charge you a $50 late fee for any reports filed late, period. So
that's interesting.
That almost doubles your fees immediately if you're not on time. And like I said, here in California, there isn't any late fee at all. You just kind of, you get your little red ding on the system, but it doesn't charge you more.
Back to some other details here, the privacy and transparency concerns, as you alluded to earlier, I think they are significant in the District of Columbia.
Yes, so we hit that there. All officers and all directors must have both their business and their residential addresses as part of the filings. And that's going forward, not just in the initial reports, but then every time you update with your biannual reports as well. So yes, you have a high level of visibility here in the district.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing in that phrase, the Section 5 of the Corporations Code, that says officers who control the financial or operational decisions or the ability to direct day-to-day operations. I guess that sort of narrows it down to like the president and the CFO. It may not include all officers, but that's something to think about.
No, I know it's uncomfortably close. Again, we're talking more of a federal thing, like where you've talked to one of your other ones about the FinCEN and what is a beneficial owner. This is kind of that similar idea of someone having control, even if they don't necessarily have a title per se that you would name them. So it's something to think about for sure as you do go forward with this.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about any other agencies within the district that the nonprofit needs to register with.
Sure. So in the district, or back to our usual, if they are organized there in the district or for a nonprofit that solicits, hold business, you will be required to file an additional registration, the basic business license for a charitable services business. Again, the district is small. This falls under the purview of the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection as well. This application should be done online through the DC Business Center, their Access DC portal. Now, this is a different portal than the Corp Online we talked about for forming your nonprofit. So even though it's coming through the same agency, they have a couple different portals. This threw me off. We have a couple of entities there in the district, and I got into the wrong one when I was trying to file my biannual report, and I was in the one here where it was more for these type of registrations. So it's good to note that, make sure that you follow the right links into which part you're trying to file.
This is registering with the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection for any nonprofit that solicits, holds assets, or does business in DC. And I suppose if you start there, at some point you'll be directed back to the foreign entity registration, right? And you have to do both.
Right. If you've not, you do need to do that step first. This is step 2. Yes, that's correct.
So you have to do that. You have to do both.
The other thing we always talk about is tax exemptions. And in the district, they do have an Office of Tax and Revenue. That's their internal taxation bureau. One interesting note we see here in the district, and this was something you brought up as we were talking about, they have a, quote, clean hands, unquote, policy, and that's under the DC Code Section 472862. And it stipulates that individuals and businesses are to be denied city goods or services, including their licenses, their permits, their grants, and contracts if there's a debt owed to the district of more than $100 for fees, fines, taxes, penalties, or failure to file your tax returns. This comes through the district here, their Office of Tax and Revenue as well. You and I were talking about this offline, but this is a low bar for losing your ability to do business somewhere. Here in California, for instance, if you don't file your statement of information, eventually the FTB will get involved with it, but that takes over time, and that's an $800 fee if you've not made it with the FTB. Here, $100 is a very low bar for losing that ability. And on the back end of this too, much like you get a good standing certificate from a Secretary of State, here you can get a certificate of clean hands for your district entities, which would be the equivalent if you had formed in the district and now you wanted to register, say here in California, you would need this. This is where you would go. And it would be a much lower.
Yeah, so it's a lower bar and covers like everything for an organization that's incorporated in DC that wants or needs to register in any other jurisdiction, they're going to have to be up to date on everything. And I'm guessing that it's not always quick to fix those things.
No. And like I said, we talked about this one, where we started with is that the Office of Tax and Revenue, you want to then make sure that you've got your tax exemptions in place. So you're not somewhere in the back end. They think you owe taxes or you need to be paying taxes when you don't because you're a non-exempt entity. I think that would be my first primary concern, is really here is someplace you really want to make sure you apply for your tax exemptions.
As I said at the top of the episode, we don't usually talk in these episodes about the pros and cons of filing in any particular jurisdiction. But I would just mention here that this is kind of a negative for filing in DC, incorporating in DC. This is a real trap for the unwary, and I think quite unusual. I think in other states, you're not going to get caught up into this kind of a morass for one missed filing that could really affect your ability to operate in DC and any other jurisdictions. So anyway, a word to the wise there. And I think we've got links in the show notes to all these agencies and the specific forms that you've talked about, right, Joe?
Yes, for sure we do. We have all the bunch of different facts, including the Clean Hands fact. We've got some for how to form specifically the domestic nonprofit. There's one from just the generic top level of their Office of Tax and Revenue. So all of those are attached.
Yeah, yes. So it sounds like their website has a lot of good frequently asked questions pages, fact pages that make it easy.
On that side, I would say they have a very robust system of answering your questions. Again, we don't know if I like the answers to the questions, but they do have answers for you.
Well, that's great. So thank you, Joe. I really appreciate you helping out with clarifying all the DC rules.
For sure.
So that's all for this episode. As we said, be sure to check out the show notes for links to these resources in DC and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. Also, as a reminder, if you go back to earlier episodes for states and jurisdictions we've already covered, be sure to check into updated laws before looking at filing or even doing your annual report in those jurisdictions. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we have a YouTube channel, the Farella, Braun, and Martell YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one we're building where all the state filing episodes are in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martell. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.